December 17, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in silent curtains across the frozen pines. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath beneath a blanket of white that muffled the rumble of distant artillery. In a clearing carved from the wilderness by war, a column of American prisoners shuffled forward through ankle-deep snow, their boots crunching against ice that had formed over the hardened mud of a dirt road. Their breath rose in pale clouds, dissipating into the December air. These were not front-line infantrymen hardened by months of combat. These were support troops, clerks, medics, engineers, and among them 23 men who just 48 hours earlier had been rehearsing Christmas carols in a makeshift chapel behind the lines. The 106th Infantry Division had collapsed under the weight of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. In 3 days, more than 7,000 American soldiers had been taken prisoner, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in the European theater. The choir from the division's Special Services Unit had been singing when the panzers broke through. Now they marched in a column guarded by Waffen-SS troops whose black uniforms stood in stark contrast to the pristine snow. Men whose insignia bore the twin lightning bolts of the Schutzstaffel, whose indoctrination had taught them that Americans were soft, decadent, ideologically hollow. The Germans expected these prisoners to break quickly, to weep, to beg, to crumble under the weight of captivity, as the Reich had been taught all democratic soldiers would when separated from their material comforts and the shallow luxuries of their capitalist homeland. What the SS did not expect, what they could not have anticipated, was that among these frozen, exhausted men walked something more dangerous than any weapon. A shared belief in something worth singing for. By the winter of 1944, the mythology of American weakness had become doctrine within the German military. From the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht to the youngest conscripts of the Waffen-SS, a narrative had been carefully cultivated. That Americans fought only because they were paid well, fed abundantly, and equipped extravagantly. That their morale depended entirely on material superiority. That once deprived of their cigarettes, their chocolate, their jazz music and Hollywood films, they would collapse into despair. This was not mere propaganda. It was strategic assumption. German intelligence reports from the Eastern Front had documented how Soviet prisoners, raised under the hammer and sickles ideology of collective sacrifice, could endure starvation, cold, and brutality with an almost inhuman resilience. American prisoners, the thinking went, would possess no such inner steel. The SS officers who now guarded this column of American POWs had been raised in a system that worshipped strength through suffering. The Hitler Youth had taught them that hardship forged character, that deprivation revealed true Aryan superiority. They had been told that democracies produced weak men, because democracy itself was weak. That a nation built on individual rights and freedoms could never match the collective will of the 1,000-year Reich. As they marched their prisoners eastward toward the Stalag camps of Germany, the guards watched for the signs of collapse they had been trained to expect. The vacant stairs, the shuffling gait of broken men, the silence of despair. What they heard instead on the evening of December 19th, as the column halted in a bombed-out village whose name had been erased from the signposts, was singing. The village had once been called Honsfeld. Now it was a skeleton of stone and timber, its buildings gutted by shellfire, its streets empty, except for the snow and the prisoners. The SS herded the Americans into what remained of a church. 4 walls and half a roof, the altar buried under rubble, the pews shattered into kindling. It was here that the prisoners would spend the night, packed shoulder to shoulder for warmth, with guards posted at every exit, and machine gun nests positioned to command the approaches. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. There were no blankets. No fires were permitted. The men huddled together in the darkness, their breath rising in visible clouds that hung in the air like the ghosts of prayers. In that darkness, someone began to hum. It started low, almost inaudible beneath the wind that whistled through the broken roof. Then a second voice joined, and a third, until the hum resolved into words, into melody, into the opening lines of "O come, all ye faithful." The 23 members of the division choir, scattered throughout the ruined church, found each other through sound. Tenor and bass, baritone and alto. They wove their voices together as they had been trained to do, as they had done in the warmth and safety of their chapel before the German offensive shattered their world. They sang without accompaniment, without hymnals, the Latin words rising through the frozen air. Venite adoremus, venite adoremus, venite adoremus Dominum. The SS guards heard it immediately. Their reaction was not what the prisoners expected. At first, there was confusion. German soldiers moved toward the church entrance, unsure whether this constituted a security threat, a provocation, or some kind of mass hysteria. An Oberscharführer, a senior squad leader whose face bore the scars of the Eastern Front, pushed open the church door and stood silhouetted against the snow, listening. The carol continued, unbroken, as if the guards did not exist. The officer shouted for silence. The singing did not stop. He raised his rifle. Still the voices continued, swelling now with the addition of men who were not trained singers, who did not know Latin but knew the melody, who hummed and added what words they remembered from childhood Christmases in places called Nebraska and Pennsylvania and Georgia. Then something unexpected occurred. One of the German guards, a young soldier who could not have been more than 19, began to weep. The mythology of the hard, ideologically pure SS man was precisely that, mythology. The Waffen-SS, despite its reputation for fanaticism, was by late 1944 a force of contradictions. Among its ranks were true believers, men who had volunteered out of genuine commitment to National Socialist ideology, who had internalized the doctrines of racial superiority and total war. But there were also conscripts, men who had been drafted from occupied territories, from the ethnic German communities of Eastern Europe, from the decimated ranks of the Wehrmacht itself as losses mounted beyond replacement. By the winter of the Ardennes offensive, SS units contained Frenchmen, Belgians, Poles of German ancestry, and even former Soviet citizens who had been offered a choice between service and starvation. The young guard who wept that night in Honsfeld had been raised in a Catholic village in the Rhineland. He had sung Adeste Fideles every Christmas of his life until 1941, when singing such songs had become complicated by the state's insistence on neo-pagan Germanic traditions. He had watched his church close, then reopen under the supervision of party officials who censored the sermons and removed the crucifix. He had been 13 when the Hitler Youth leaders told him that Christianity was a weakness, a Jewish corruption of the strong Germanic spirit. Now, 3 years into service, and after 6 months on the Western Front, he stood in the ruins of a Belgian church, listening to enemy prisoners sing the carol of his childhood. And something inside him fractured. The Oberscharführer saw the young soldier's tears and struck him across the face with an open palm. Discipline was absolute. Sentiment was weakness. The guard wiped his eyes and returned to his post, but the damage had been done. Seeds of doubt, once planted, are impossible to uproot entirely. The singing continued through the night, carols giving way to hymns, hymns to patriotic songs, until finally exhaustion claimed even the most determined voices, and silence fell over the ruined church. But that silence was not the silence the SS had expected. It was not the silence of broken men. It was the silence of men who had reminded themselves why they fought. Historical accounts of prisoner-of-war experiences often focus on the physical deprivations: starvation, disease, forced labor, the brutal mathematics of survival in the camps. But the battle for a prisoner's spirit begins long before the stalag gates close behind them. It begins in the first hours of captivity, when the shock of surrender is fresh, when the future contracts into an unknown void of barbed wire and guard towers. The captors understand this. Control the narrative in those first hours, convince the prisoner that they have been abandoned, that their cause was hollow, that their nation has forgotten them, and physical deprivation will do the rest. The SS employed a sophisticated system of psychological warfare against their prisoners. American POWs were shown German newsreels depicting devastating U-boat attacks on Atlantic convoys, implying that reinforcements would never arrive. They were read carefully edited versions of American newspaper articles that emphasized labor strikes on the home front, racial tensions, political divisions, anything to suggest that the United States was fracturing internally. They were told that President Roosevelt was dying, that General Eisenhower had been relieved of command, that the Allied offensive had stalled. Some of these claims were lies, some were exaggerations, some were uncomfortable truths weaponized for maximum demoralization. What the SS had not accounted for was that American prisoners carried their own counter-narrative, one not dependent on newspapers or newsreels, or the assurances of their captors. They carried it in their memories, in their shared culture, in the songs they had learned as children, and the principles they had been taught as citizens. The men of that captured choir knew instinctively what their guards could not comprehend: that American strength did not flow from abundance, but from the idea that had created that abundance. That democracy was not a system of material distribution, but a covenant of shared belief. That freedom was not a luxury, but a foundation. When they sang in that ruined church, they were not performing for their captors. They were reminding each other, and themselves, of the civilization they represented. Every carol was a declaration: we are still here. We have not been erased. Our spirit is not for sale, not negotiable, not subject to the calculus of guards and barbed wire. The column resumed its march on December 20th, heading east toward Germany. The prisoners walked for 6 days, covering more than 60 miles on foot through snow and ice, with minimal food and no shelter. Men developed frostbite. Some collapsed and were left behind. Whether they were shot, frozen, or somehow survived became a matter of post-war testimony and disputed records. The SS guards drove the column hard, alternating between threats and indifference, their own supplies strained by the chaotic logistics of the German offensive. Each night, when the column halted, the singing resumed. Not always from the trained choir members. Many were too weak, too ill, too focused on the immediate struggle to survive. But others took up the tradition. Men who had never sung in public before found their voices. They sang "God Bless America." They sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. They sang crude, humorous songs learned in basic training, songs about incompetent sergeants and inedible rations, songs that transform suffering into camaraderie. The singing became a form of resistance, a nightly ritual that defined the prisoners as something more than victims. The guards' reactions evolved over the course of that march. Some remained hostile, shouting for silence, threatening punishment. Others grew indifferent, recognizing that the singing posed no tactical threat. A few, a minority but a significant one, began to show signs of the same fracture that had appeared in the young Rhineland soldier. They did not join the singing, but they stopped trying to suppress it. They looked away. They found excuses to patrol other sections of the column when the hymns began. One Unterscharführer, a squad leader from Saxony who had fought at Stalingrad, was heard muttering to a fellow guard on the fifth night, "They sing like men who believe they have already won." This was the insight that the SS could not reconcile with their ideology. According to the doctrine they had been taught, prisoners should be grateful for survival, cowed by the display of German military might, stripped of illusions. These Americans exhibited none of those qualities. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, and captured. And yet they sang as if captivity was merely an interruption, a temporary deviation from an inevitable trajectory. They sang as if the outcome was not in doubt. On December 26, the column arrived at Stalag 4B near Mühlberg, a sprawling camp complex that housed over 30,000 prisoners from a dozen nations. The Americans were processed, deloused, photographed, and assigned to barracks where the bunks were stacked 3 high and the straw mattresses crawled with lice. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, were systematically looted by the guards before distribution. Dysentery and typhus were endemic. Men died, not from single catastrophic events, but from the accumulated weight of deprivation, their bodies slowly consuming themselves. It was here, in the industrial machinery of captivity, that the choir's resistance took on new meaning. Barracks 17C, where many of the division's prisoners were housed, became known throughout the American sections of the camp as the Singing Barracks. Men who had marched with the choir organized evening performances, using wooden planks as risers and tin cups as percussion. They sang jazz arrangements, classical pieces, folk songs from every region of America. They held concerts on Christmas Eve, on New Year's, on every Sunday. Other prisoners crowded into the barracks to listen, standing in the aisles because there was no room to sit, breathing air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and illness. And for 45 minutes, they were transported. The German commandant initially permitted these concerts because he believed they would make the prisoners more docile. Music, he reasoned, was a distraction, an opiate. Let them sing themselves into complacency. He did not understand, could not have understood, that the concerts were having the opposite effect. Each performance was a demonstration of organized defiance. It proved that the prisoners retained the capacity for beauty, for discipline, for collective achievement. It proved they had not been reduced to animals concerned only with food and survival. Word of the singing barracks reached other compounds. British prisoners requested permission to attend. French POWs traded cigarettes and bread rations for spots in the audience. Even some Soviet prisoners, held in a separate section under far harsher conditions, managed to listen from outside the barracks walls. The concerts became a form of international communion, a reminder that beyond the barbed wire and guard towers and machine gun nests existed a world worth returning to, a civilization worth preserving. Among the German guards, the singing produced a slow, almost invisible corrosion of certainty. This was not a single dramatic event, not a mass refusal to follow orders, or a collective laying down of weapons. It was subtler, more insidious. The gradual recognition that the enemy they had been taught to despise possessed something the Reich could not provide its own soldiers. The Americans sang because they wanted to, because the act itself had meaning independent of orders or ideology. The guards stood watch because they had to, because discipline and terror and the machinery of the state compelled them. A German corporal named Hans Richter, assigned to Barracks 17C, kept a diary that was discovered after the war among the effects of a Soviet officer who had liberated Stalag 4B in April 1945. In an entry dated February 3, 1945, Richter wrote, "The Americans sang tonight again. 32 men died in the camp today. Frostbite, dysentery, pneumonia. The medical officer says we will lose more tomorrow. I do not understand why the Americans sing. They should be as miserable as we are. But they sing like men who know something we have forgotten. I think it is something about why they fight. We fight because we are told to. They fight because they believe. This was the hymn that broke the SS spirit. Not a single song, but the persistent, unyielding demonstration that ideology built on coercion could not match belief grounded in consent. The Americans sang because no one could stop them from singing. Their captors stood silent because their own songs had been prescribed, mandated, emptied of meaning by the very system that demanded their performance. By March 1945, as the Red Army closed on Stalag 4B from the east and American forces advanced from the west, discipline among the guards began to deteriorate. Some fled. Others simply abandoned their posts, changing into civilian clothes and melting into the refugee columns that clogged the roads. A few sought out American POWs they had treated well, asking them to remember their names, to testify that they had not been cruel, had not beaten prisoners, had sometimes looked away when regulations were violated. They had not joined the singing, but the singing had entered them nonetheless, had exposed the hollow core of everything they had been taught to believe. Stalag 4B was liberated on April 23, 1945, by units of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. The Americans were evacuated within days, first to Allied field hospitals, then to processing centers, finally to transport ships that carried them home. Of the 23 members of the 106th Division Choir who had been captured in the Ardennes, 18 survived to see liberation. 5 died in captivity, 3 from disease, 1 from injuries sustained during an Allied bombing raid that struck near the camp, 1 from causes listed in Red Cross records as exhaustion. The survivors were debriefed by Army intelligence, examined by doctors, reunited with families who had spent months not knowing whether their sons and husbands were alive or dead. They returned to a nation celebrating victory, but struggling to comprehend what that victory had cost. Most did not speak publicly about their captivity. The culture of the era encouraged veterans to move forward, to reintegrate quietly, to translate their experiences into private memory rather than public narrative. But the singing did not stop. Several members of the choir reunited in civilian life, forming a semi-professional vocal group that performed throughout the Midwest in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They sang at veterans halls, church fundraisers, high school graduations. They sang the same carols they had sung in the ruins of that Belgian church, the same hymns they had performed in Barracks 17C. To audiences who had not experienced captivity, the performances were merely entertainment, perhaps tinged with patriotic sentiment. To those who had been there, who had stood in that frozen darkness and felt the words form in their throats, the singing was something else. A victory that could not be taken, a freedom that had never been surrendered. There is a photograph taken in April 1945 by a Soviet war correspondent that captures a moment just after liberation. It shows American prisoners standing outside the barracks of Stalag 4B, their faces gaunt, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that have lost 30, 40, 50 pounds. They are arranged in rows, as if for a choir performance. Some are smiling. Some are too weak to stand without support. In the background, Soviet soldiers watch, curious, uncomprehending. And in the center of the photograph, barely visible in the grain of the aged film, one man's mouth is open mid-note, captured in the act of singing. No record exists of what song was being performed when the photograph was taken. Witnesses provided conflicting accounts. Some remembered the Star-Spangled Banner. Others, America the Beautiful. Still others, a hymn whose name they could not recall. It does not matter. What matters is that they were singing. That after 6 months of captivity, after cold and hunger and disease, after watching friends die and wondering if they would be next, their response to liberation was not silence, not tears, not the 1,000-yard stare of broken men, but song. The SS had expected the captured choir to provide them with confirmation of their ideology. They expected to see American prisoners weep, beg, and collapse under deprivation. They expected material abundance to reveal itself as the only true source of American strength, so that its absence would produce immediate surrender of the spirit. Instead, they encountered something their training had not prepared them for. The realization that democracy's power lay not in what it provided its citizens, but in what it asked of them. Not obedience, but participation. Not submission, but consent. Not prescribed loyalty, but chosen allegiance. The hymn that broke the SS spirit was the sound of free men singing because they chose to sing. It was the demonstration that no amount of barbed wire, no ideology of racial superiority, no doctrine of total war could silence the voice of a person who understood why their freedom mattered. The Germans could capture the choir. They could not capture the song. Epilogue. Epilogue. In the spring of 1947, a German pastor named Friedrich Weber published a small pamphlet in Munich titled Lieder aus dem Schatten, Songs from the Shadows. It was not widely distributed, and most copies were destroyed during the paper shortages of the post-war years. But it contained interviews with former guards from various prisoner-of-war camps, men trying to make sense of what they had witnessed, what they had participated in, what they now had to carry forward. One interview, with an unnamed former Oberscharführer who had served in the Ardennes, contains this passage. We were taught that our enemy was weak because they were free, that freedom made men soft, undisciplined, unable to endure hardship. I believed this, until I heard them sing. They sang in the ruins, they sang on the march, they sang when they were starving. And I understood, too late, that we had been lied to. They were not weak because they were free. They were strong because they knew what freedom was for. We sang when we were ordered. They sang when everything had been taken from them. That is the difference between power and strength. Power can be taken. Strength cannot. This is the lesson the captured choir taught. That the human spirit, when rooted in principles deeper than ideology, cannot be conquered by mere circumstance. That the true measure of a nation is not its abundance in victory, but its character in defeat. That democracy's greatest weapon is not its material superiority, but the unyielding belief of free people that their freedom is worth defending, worth suffering for, worth singing about. Even in the darkness. The SS expected broken men. They found voices that would not be silenced. And in that cold winter of 1944, in the ruins of churches and the barracks of prison camps, the sound of those voices sang the obituary of a regime that mistook cruelty for strength and obedience for loyalty. The hymn continues.